My name is John Medendorp. I'm from Michigan State University. I'm in the Higher Adult and Lifelong Education PhD program there in my second year, and we're doing research on, or I personally am doing research on cognitive models for teaching and learning with open educational resources.
I'm Brendan Guenther. I'm the director at Virtual University Design and Technology, which is a support unit at Michigan State University that helps faculty do a variety of programs related to online learning. And we see ourselves, in addition to being a great research university, to be a globally engaged university. And we're trying to use this framework that we're going to present. Oh, that's not me. That's reassuring. We're trying to use this framework to help support the institution's engagement with a variety of open educational projects, and actually you have a chance to you have a chance to hear from a couple of our colleagues. I believe later in the day, Guenther is presenting on one of the food safety projects that we're doing, and tomorrow Christine Guenther is presenting as well.
So with that, we'll get started. We're using a Prezi presentation, and if you're familiar with this, it can be somewhat dizzying, especially if you go through the points too quickly. And in this early part, we're going to kind of skim over the whole development section because I think some of those principles are just assumed. And I want to get to the cognitive model. So we'll start by looking at using open educational resources for monitoring and evaluation, or using monitoring and evaluation systems for looking at open educational resources. I think we all understand what monitoring and evaluation consists of. It's a retro feedback cycle that allows us to gather analysis data and then apply it as the World Bank suggests in their 10 steps. But the question is, what is development? And when we're talking about open educational resources, we all intuitively understand that it has application in development, but we don't quite understand how it's going to be applied. In Karen and Patrick's presentation this morning, they put up a graphic which showed the disparity between OER production and OER usage. And in developing countries where most of this is being consumed, that disparity is even greater because there just either isn't infrastructure or the resources aren't usable in context, and that's the problem that we want to address this afternoon. So the early understandings of development all focused on economics, and like I said, I'm going to click through this rather quickly. It was Guenther Myrdal in 1974 who expanded the definition to include other things beyond just the traditional things of GMP and consumption. He looked at health, he looked at education, distributions of power or governance, and then more broadly at society in terms of how institutions are formed and how social and cultural attitudes are formed. All of these contribute to what we understand as development. Amartya Sen added the dimension of freedom, and freedom, development as freedom became one of the foundational points for the United Nations when they developed their Human Development Index in 1996. And by 2004, the World Bank was even on board. They understood it as a human-centered process with social, economic, and environmental objectives, so they had expanded their definition beyond the economic as well. And this is the Department for International Development. This is probably the most complete definition of development that we have. I like what Joseph Rimini has done. He looked at 4 false assumptions about development, and I want to get to his definition, so I'm going to go through this. He looked at as both process and outcome. So development is a series of processes, and development also is certain outcomes. And among those processes, which are people-centered and participatory, are things such as governance and education, policy, of course, institutional structures. And then there are outcomes that come out of these processes that constitute development, such as health as the most basic, security, but then also higher level outcomes such as justice, opportunity, and self-determination, both as individuals and as a people. So with that concept of development in mind, which mirrors rather closely actually Maslow's hierarchy of needs, doesn't it? This is the social application of this movement towards self-actualization as a society. The question is, how can OER support this process of development? And this is the nitty-gritty of our presentation today. The World Bank World Development Report in 1998 focused on knowledge as the motor of development. And they said there were three dimensions to knowledge. There was knowledge acquisition, knowledge absorption, and knowledge communication. But we looked at these and said, well, it really falls short because, first of all, there's a prior step, an assumption of knowledge creation, but then also knowledge utilization, which becomes, for development, the most important aspect of the use of knowledge. So we tried to think through how is it that knowledge can be used through open educational resources so that it actually advances a development agenda. And we found Nonaka's spiral of knowledge creation helpful in understanding how knowledge gets embedded in a particular context, but then within that context begins to create new knowledge which is applicable to that specific context. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Nonaka's model, but if you look to the extreme left here, this is the basic thrust of his theory, that there are levels of tacit knowledge which are present in all persons and in all cultures, and then there's more explicit knowledge which is articulate, it's systematized, and is communicable between persons. What Nonaka says is that knowledge creation is always a process of interaction between what is tacit in the individual or in a society and what is explicit through either that society or through other societies, where you can have communities of conversation about and around knowledge. So what we understand is that if we're going to use open educational resources for development, it has to somehow engage this process of interaction between tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge in a society. It's not enough simply to provide content, that there have to be other processes which move that content into a conversation with the tacit knowledge that's present in the societies to which it is delivered. We then moved to another step further and looked at Holden and von Kortzfleisch's model for knowledge management as language translation. What they said is that knowledge management, much like language translation, moves information from one literary or verbal context into another verbal context. And each time that the language is moved from one context to another, it has to be recontextualized. So there's a process of deconstruction that takes place in the movement of knowledge from one place to another. Since most OER is north-south or developed world to underdeveloped world, these contexts have to be taken into account if OER is going to have the impact for development that we want it to have. So as you can see, what they've done is they've embedded Nonaka's model here. And what they've said, in effect, is that much like language translation, it moves knowledge content from one embedded cultural context into another embedded cultural context, or at least it moves into that context for the purpose of embedding that knowledge in that new context. And it shares this model. If you're familiar with Rand Spiro's work, which I'm going to get to in just a minute, there's two schema. There's the schema of the person who provides the knowledge content, and then there's the schema, the intellectual schema of the person who receives the content. And so knowledge transfer becomes a movement of knowledge from one schema into another. And as you can see, that would require an act of deconstruction and reconstruction. And depending on the level of schematic overlap, it's going to be easier or more difficult. Some cultures are more distant than others. So what are the basic points of knowledge in a new context that would motivate development? And those have to be, and this is in the conversation of development agencies right now, creativity, innovation, problem solving, entrepreneurship. And we found this very similar to Rand Spiro's model of cognitive flexibility. So what we're going to do as we elaborate this model is we're going to try to take these concepts that Rand Spiro created of cognitive flexibility, that is thinkers who are able to think in what he calls ill-structured domains. They're able to take knowledge that is not proper to a domain, and they're able to reassemble it within a new domain, an ill-structured domain, and make application within that domain. And these are some of the areas that Rand Spiro identifies that identify cognitive flexibility. So this is our model for cross-cultural knowledge transfer, and it has 4 domains: content production, content adaptation, content translation, and content application. So for the evaluation points in a monitoring and evaluation system for content creation, we would look at cultural embeddedness, cross-cultural transferability, content adaptability for hypertext, awareness of end-user context. Then for content adaptation, use of hypertext, user-friendliness, translatability, explicit instructional goals. For content translation, appropriate linguistic translation, of course, is basic to it, but then beyond that, the use of co-creation as a means of embedding knowledge into new contexts and socialization of content, cultural re-embedding, and then finally, for content application, creation of cognitive flexibility, entrepreneurial, innovative, creative problem-solving in-context skills. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Britt.
So I'm going to work with a couple of examples, and I hope some of you have been in this conference more than once, or this isn't your first time, because I'm hoping you're familiar with the examples. One would be the Teacher Education in Sub-Saharan Africa project, which we're going to use as an example, I think, that fits the model that we've developed fairly well. I'm hoping that you can see some of what John talked about represented in their activities to the extent that you're hopefully already familiar with them. And our counterpoint isn't actually MIT OpenCourseware, but it's more a specific use of that. So we're familiar with several institutions that have cached local copies of MIT OpenCourseware and are attempting to use it in some way to enhance their curriculum. But the caveat behind that is that MIT isn't really intending to be an international development project. It just happens to be low-hanging fruit that people grab onto. And I think almost every project would identify MIT's leadership in terms of being willing to put OpenCourseware out there as one of the things that really started this momentum and got this group really energized, or at least, even if you were already working with Open Educational, being able to show that MIT was doing what they were doing certainly enabled you to get buy-in from the executive level. So looking at, this is just one example of one of the many papers that have been published on Tessa's work. Tessa is very audience-focused from the very beginning. They had the audience, the end user of the OER in mind. It was intended to be a collaboration of many organizations throughout. There is no real clear north-south polarity. It's not south-north. It's not north-south. The adaptation of the content from the original creation all the way through the various translation steps down into 9 different countries with different stories and examples that relate to the actual learning content. And really the impact of that project isn't in the creation of the content. It's the use of the content as a means of development of teachers who are the true end users of the OER. So throughout the whole process, their objective was to encourage the development of teachers in Africa. So this is actually a diagram of the TESA process, which I've overlaid in red with the 4 realms of the cross-cultural knowledge transfer model that John discussed. So things begin kind of with step 1 with creation from many of the main partners with OER content that's intended as kind of basic lesson plans, so setting of objectives, specific learning objectives for the outline, and they're developing that OER in a way where it's intended that it's just kind of raw material for translation and adaptation at a local level. By the time you move down to step 2 and 3 there, you're actually getting into applying it, translating it by language, but also across culture. And by the time you get to step 4, you're actually localizing it to a specific country or community in which it's going to be deployed. You're actually engaging the teachers that are going to be using it in co-creation in this loop. And then the content application happens when the teachers actually use it in the classroom, reflect on the experience of using it, and inform future improvement and possibly provide edits to the material. And this all, of course, throughout this cycle is ending up improving the OER in the resource bank. So again, MIT Courseware not a development program, TESA clearly a development program. So I think this kind of shows the limits of content as opposed to focusing on the audience and the practices. So there has been some attempts to gather evidence in terms of what's happening with the OCW material and who's using it and what are they using it for. And clearly there's a lot of marketing by MIT around this as well. I won't go into those points. So some of what I've heard from people that have a copy of MIT OCW at their institution is it's like, well, yep, we would establish the repository, and usually there's some administrators or a couple of faculty leaders that are excited about that and made that happen, but then, the common faculty member says, I'm not really sure what to do with it. And this is the same thing I hear about things like Orange Grove in Florida or the Minnesota repository. There are a few people that are really fired up about it and are maybe using it heavily, but the average faculty member at the institution doesn't really know what to do about it. And maybe doesn't even know it exists. So we're really saying that if you're going to fund an OER project as a means for building institutional capacity, so embedded in individuals who have tacit knowledge, the processes and the practices and how you're going to essentially deal with a feedback loop like you saw with TESA, where the OER is improved and embedded locally, that's really the key thing to look at. I mean, source content is a really important part of that, but it's really just kind of the beginning of what should be focused on. And certainly, measuring quantity of content produced or even maybe content used, included in a course at the destination institution is probably a really insufficient means of evaluating the outcomes of the project. So this is a quote I nabbed from one of Neil's papers from last year. So it's the process, and it's the people, and it's the context. And that's how we really are going to gain diversity, particularly when we're looking at North-South partnerships for development. So again, go beyond the OER products and the content itself, and look at the processes for creating and adapting the material. And again, this is a summary of the possible points for evaluation. Do you have any closing words?
Good. No. I think we can open it for questions at this point.
Sorry I raced through that. I'm trying to get you all to lunch and the other speakers. But
there's a question in the back there.
That's the point. In your experience, when working with institutions using OERs, to what extent does it change in your, or to which dimensions or points, aspects would be changed in the institutional culture or the institutional understanding, what identity may be? I think you have a lot of experience, and I would be very interested in that.
You want to talk about it?
So, correct me if I'm misinterpreting your question, but if you're talking about like the different type of institution or organizational culture within the institution, I think certainly, whether you have tenured type faculty versus contingent faculty, how much staff turnover you have, whether this is a continuous development problem that you're trying to solve because of high turnover. That's certainly the case with TESA. There's more, I believe, teachers dying in certain part of Africa than there are coming out of formal training programs, right? So it's not just a matter of getting the teachers that are in service trained up. It's a matter of continuously training new teachers. And that would be different if you're talking about at the higher education level, anywhere in the world, where in most cases the faculty tends to be a little bit more steady. So it's more about slowly growing the spread of these kind of practices. So moving beyond the initial adopters to actually mainstreaming this kind of activity and eventually embedding it in the culture, so to create a culture of sharing and a culture of collaboration. Does that answer your question?
Are you talking about recipient institutions or producer institutions? Mostly recipient institutions, yeah. I think there has to be a greater acknowledgement and appreciation for tacit knowledge in context. We have to learn to interact more effectively with that tacit knowledge. There has to be an introduction of Mode 2 learning in the educational process. There has to be an appreciation for that as well. So, the internal culture of recipient institutions as well as the internal culture of producer institutions has to change in order for this to be effective.
And in a way, we're actually trying to set Brandon's presentation up by pointing out that, taking a whole course as an OER is really difficult for the recipient faculty member, even if they're fired up and interested in using it, to essentially adapt it and use it in a way that's useful to their educational goals and their context, even within the same institution. I think is the point that Brandon's going to make. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you.